Hey guys, welcome back. So in this video, we are going to get shots being fired on a regular basis from these enemies like this and doing a reasonable amount of damage, and also the player will disappear when they run out of health. All right, I'm just going to move the projectile script over to the enemies for the moment. We might well share that projectile script later, but as it's only being used by enemies at the moment, let's move it over there. So the enemy is sending out projectiles every single frame right now. Let's see what we can do about that. One way we can deal with that is to have a status in the player, which can be a Boolean called isAttacking. And we can just default that to false. So by default, the player is not attacking. Then what we can do is when we come and spawn the projectile, we can say, well, we only need to spawn a projectile if the player... When we only need to start the process of repeatedly spawning projectiles, which is what we want to end up doing, if the enemy wasn't previously in attacking mode. So only if not is attacking and the player moves into the radius, all right? So we say and for the logical and. So if the player moves into the radius and we're not currently attacking, then what we're going to want to do is something a little bit different to spawn projectile. We're going to want to repeatedly spawn the projectile. We'll see how to do that in a minute. We're doing that. We're slowing it down. Repeatedly spawn the projectile, and then, well, in either order actually, but we may as well immediately say isAttacking equals true. So we don't come back in here every frame and layer a repeating spawning of the projectile on top of each other every frame. We just want to repeatedly spawn the projectile. Now, how do we do that? Well, we've got a method called InvokeRepeating. I'll show you that. And you can just look up InvokeRepeating Unity. No point in me spoon-feeding you by adding it to the resources, really. And you can see how this works. It works by just providing a string reference for the name of the method that you want to repeat, an initial delay, and then a repeat rate. All right, now I don't like this because it's string referenced, but let's use it the first time round, and I promise you that next time we do this sort of thing, we'll do coroutines proper from scratch, all right? But let's just use InvokeRepeating because it's the simplest and most natural for this sort of thing. So what you do is instead of just calling spawn projectile, we say InvokeRepeating, and then we string reference the method name. Yep, you should be spitting. That's horrible. Because why? We can't rename this method now without losing the connection, even using a refactor tool. So that sucks. So we InvokeRepeating spawn projectile after how long? Well, immediately. And how fast are we going to repeat? Well, we better put a member variable for this. So damage per shot, attack damage, attack radius, we better put it in here. And we could put it as a time between shots, or we could put it as a shots per second. I think I'm going to go time, so seconds, let's be specific, between shots, and then let's say we fire, I don't know, every half a second, something like that, as a default. Okay, so we have a seconds between shots, and that's what we provide to the invoke. We say, invoke a repeating call to spawn projectiles, string reference, starting after 0 seconds, and firing off every and then seconds between shots. Now, I'm going to straight away say to do, switch to coroutines. But for teaching purposes, this is perfectly reasonable to show you InvokeRepeating to start with. Firstly, let's make sure this works. And then we'll talk a little bit about InvokeRepeating, and then we'll move on and get some sort of weapon in the player's hand so we can get damage working the other way. So, there you go, that's working. Why are we getting an initial spawn? We're not, it's just that I left a projectile in the world. So let's go ahead and see what happens. If I move in here, this dude shoots at the players, aiming at his feet. This aiming at the feet thing's annoying. We'll sort that out, or you can sort that out in your challenge. But the InvokeRepeating's working. And then if I was to turn this dude's fire rate up, I just have to say time between shots, say 0.1, just operating on the instance, and then you'll notice that this guy will fire much faster than anybody else. Cool, and the player is taking significant punishment from these ridiculous balls. The player, of course, is not dying, but right now I'm just trying to get a particular thing done. I'm trying to give this to Rick so that he can, he's got this attack radius, he's got the move radius, he's got some damage on the projectiles, and he's got some flexibility. The fact the player doesn't die and disappear doesn't really matter now. I can come back in after a little stint of Mr. Rick in Australia, and we can make the player die and we can make the enemies die. We probably need to make the enemies die when they get down to 0 health in the next video because we don't want them running around, but the player doesn't really need to die. We know that the player's dead when his health gets to 0. If you want to make him die, it's super trivial to do that. You just come into the player. In fact, fact, we can do it right now if you wish. We can just say if current health points less than or equal to 0, and then we simply say, we can even just do it here, destroy, and then game object, i.e. ourselves, all right? And then a semicolon. It can be done in a single line. So let's just see if that works, and then I'll show you the line if it does, because I typed that so fast you wouldn't have had a chance of reading it. So let's just check the player goes. He does. So that's the line you want to put in. If the current health is less than 0, destroy the game object. So there you go. I've said I wasn't going to teach you it, but that's as easy as that to stop the player, to kill the player. All right, so we talked about invoke repeating. It works, but it's string reference. Now let's move on to the next issue, which is a very brief overview of StartCoroutine, just so you've got some context to where we're going in the long run. StartCoroutine is completely different, much more complex, and is going to require at least a full video on its own. I just want to show you it being used. You say coroutine equals, say, wait and print 2 seconds, and then wait and print is actually a method name. So this is type safe. This wait and print, if you refactored here, then both of these would change. So that's much nicer. But you need to understand the concept of treating a function as an I enumerator and what this means with things like yield and lazy evaluation. It's a bit involved. Coroutines are much, much more flexible, much more powerful than just using invoke repeating, but you really need a lot more mental framework if you've never seen these guys before, and I need to take you through that a lot more slowly and help you really understand about the queue and the execution order. So we won't do that here, but I just wanted to explain that this is a perfectly valid alternative, but don't use it yet. Just use invoke repeating in the very simple cases until later you get really comfortable with coroutines, and then we'll probably never use invoke repeating again. All right, so that's some context to you as to why I'm using invoke repeating here. Now, let's, and I've also just given you a very quick overview of coroutine, sort of. Invoke repeating is a coroutine. What you need to know about invoke repeating is that it will just keep calling spawn projectile until you say cancel invoke. So we ought to think about the case in which we cancel invoke. Why would the player, or when would this enemy stop shooting at the player? Well, it better stop shooting at the player once we get back outside the radius, right? That would make a ton of sense. So we've got this idea that when the player is less than the attack radius and it's not attacking, that it does this stuff. But what we'd better say is, well, we can do it as an else. Now, you've got to think about the logic here. What is the set of things that is not when he's inside the radius and not attacking? Should we do a little Venn diagram? That's probably a good idea. So we get a sketch pad up here, and I clear it for the moment. So at the moment, what we've got from a logic point of view, we've got a universe of possibilities out here. My God, that's too messy. Let me just move my, my sketch pad. Now, messy's fine with these diagrams, but that messy is ridiculous. So this is the universe of all possibilities. And then what we're looking at is we're saying, well, where's the code? The code is here. We're saying if the distance of the player is less than attack radius. So let's just go back to my sketch. In radius. And so we're inside this radius, and we're not attacking. Not attacking. So this is this portion here. And he just, once you come into his attack radius, once when you previously weren't attacking, he starts firing. Now what we need to do is at any point that you are outside of the radius, so in any of this space out here, we need to just say, if that happens, then you need to stop the invoke, stop firing. So it's actually easier just to put a completely separate if statement here, in my opinion, to say that if you're outside the radius, stop firing. So why don't we just say if distance to player is greater than attack radius, just switch that condition round, not bother with any else, which is hard to reason about, then we just stop repeating, and then the way you do that is you say cancel invoke. So let's just check that that works and that I got my logic right. Hope I did after all that messing around with Venn diagrams. So I come in here, but when I get out of radius, he stops shooting. Does this apply to the other guys? I come in, they all start shooting at me, but I get out of radius and they stop shooting. Sort of working. What we're doing is we're not toggling the is attacking Boolean off again either. So when we're out of radius, in is attacking is false, and that makes sense. Okay, so provided that we set that as well, I think you'll find that they will attack. And then when you get out of radius, they stop attacking, and then he will re-attack when I get in radius. So if I try and run through the middle of these guys, which is the sort of thing Rick's going to be doing, it's actually going to be challenging now to run between them, then they will attack me when I'm in radius, and provided I've got enough room to get through, bit of pathfinding issues we can sort out later, then they stop firing. Okay, basically this dude is firing far too fast and he's just obliterating me within seconds. That's part of my problem. So just slow him down a tad and we get to test it a little bit more sensibly. These dudes are firing at me and chasing me. Okay, it's all very rough and ready, but it's the foundations. Okay, so that's the code I've put in, okay, as a separate thing. Right, now, what comes next? Let's just take a little look at my lesson plan. It's saying test enemies are damaging the player. So basically, I just want to test now that the damage, well, we just have effectively tested the enemies are damaging the player. I think that is working fine. What I want to do is make you do the final tidy up. So here's your challenge. What we want to do is each enemy has customizable damage. We've already done that. Make your projectile prettier if you like. I'm going to stick with these ugly yellow things, but I'd suggest you make yours prettier, make it more like your project. Attack and chase spheres work. They do seem to, but check yours still work. This is a good time to tidy up your project. We want at least 2 projectiles with customizable velocity. I believe I've already done that in my project. If you haven't yet, then let's just have a couple of different projectiles for the designer part of you coming along shortly. And I want you to hide damage on the projectile to save confusion. That's a bit confusing that there's both damage on the projectile and the enemy. So go ahead and hide that in the code and then share your progress with us. Ideally a 20-second video clip of the combat to date in action. So go ahead, pause the video and do that little challenge now. All right, so out of that list, the only thing that I think I've got to do is I better test that my fast projectile looks faster. So I choose that enemy there and I look at him and I say, okay, for this instance, let's have a fast projectile. So let's see if this near guy fires a projectile that looks much faster. Boom, it does. And the other thing I want to do is to hide the damage property, damage caused on the projectile, because that's rather confusing. So to hide it, one of the things we need to do is just make it not public, i.e. it defaults in C# back to private. And now the problem with that is, well, we just try running it, see what the problem with it is. One of the classes is going to say, hang on, I can't do projectile.damage caused inside enemy because it's no longer public, so we're going to need to make a setter. So that's going to be quite easy. It's void, and we say set damage, and we take in a float damage. And then we simply say damage caused equals damage. So just a vanilla, standard object-oriented way of doing this. Of course, we need to make our setter public. And then over in the enemy where we wanted to use it, we can, instead of using the property, we can just say projectile component.setDamage, and then it is just damage per shot. All right, so I've hidden that property. So then when we come back in here, and when our designer takes a little look at the enemy projectiles here, they don't have a damage on them, and they go, oh, well, we need to set the damage on the enemy damage per shot. All right, but hopefully the code will still operate the same. So that's done. That's all simplified. I hope that makes sense, and I'll see you in the next video.